Alright, this video is called Survey and Bias. So our learning target is I can determine if surveys are biased. Okay, so let's think about this. What makes a good survey? The data collected from a survey is only as good as the design of the survey itself. Consider these 3 questions, all meant to determine a presidential approval rating. A, do you approve of the way the current president is doing his job? B, do you approve, disapprove, or neither approve or disapprove of the way the current president is doing his job? C, how proud does the current president make you feel to be an American? So you just tell me which question do you think is best and why you picked that one. There's not a right or wrong answer. Leaving it blank is wrong. It's the only way you're going to get that one wrong. Alright, so you just think about it and tell me what you think. Alright, so you could survey the same group of people using all 3 questions and end up with different levels of approval. So we need to design surveys carefully so that doesn't happen. So here's your 3 key ideas. First, you got to think about the sample. Alright, it has to accurately represent the population. So if I did a survey and I only asked, blonde-headed people what they thought about the president, that's really not an accurate representation because there's brunette people and red-headed people and bald people, and they have an opinion too. You can't just single a certain group out. Alright, number 2, the next thing is you need to randomize samples just to keep it accurate. So once again, you're picking random people. Has to be completely random or it doesn't work. And then 3, the sample size definitely matters. So if you're ever playing Family Feud and they ask a question, you're like, where do they get these people? And they only surveyed 100 people out of the total population. Sometimes that's a pretty good indication that's not a good survey, So good surveys are going to avoid bias always. Alright, let's talk about bias. So here's an example. A high school has 100 students in each grade level, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. You survey 30 9th graders, 15 10th graders, 5 11th graders, and 5 12th graders. Your results will be biased toward responses to the 9th graders and not representative of the whole school population because you picked the most 9th graders and that doesn't represent everybody in the school. Alright, so here's an example to think about. Wednesday. Change that to say. Let's say you want to find out how many hours Math 4 students sleep. What are some ways that you might find out this information? So I want you to think about it, pause the video, come up with something in 1, 2, 3. Alright, so here's my example I came up with. I'm going to survey the first 5 people that come to class. So think about the example that you put down and think about what might be some bias. So if I survey the first 5 people in class, I'm only looking at the early birds, and that doesn't represent the entire population of the class because probably if you're early to class, then you slept good and you got up on time, and that's not going to represent everybody. So that's where my bias is. So you try to think about the bias that you came up with. Okay, so there's 3 types of sampling bias that we'll talk about. First is selection, second is non-response, and 3 is voluntary. So let me give you some information about them and some examples. Okay, so for selection, this means some members of a population are not represented in the survey. So an example, the selection of participants was poor. So here's an example. Surveying only people who have access to a certain app in order to get responses about internet use. That would be selection bias. Okay, number 2, non-response. So individuals who are chosen to survey are unable or unwilling to respond. It's like me when the census comes around. I just hide in my house because I don't care. So an example, respondents to the presidential approval survey tend to be only from the president's political party. And that makes sense. So if you send out something about Joe Biden, probably more people, like more Democrats, are going to respond. But maybe some Republicans want to voice their concerns, or they might respond. But more Democrats typically are going to respond to instead of Republican. All right. And then the last one is voluntary. So members surveyed are self-selected. So i.e., they volunteer. Alright, so this eliminates people who choose not to respond. Alright, so an example, a blog poll only receives responses from those who choose to respond. Well, duh. Because if you choose not to respond, you're not going to get responses back from those people. Alright. So there's something called response bias. Even if you sample well, you can still get a response bias. So those may be 2 different things. They can be leading questions or they can be social desirability. So leading questions are written to evoke specific responses. So an example, a satisfaction survey may ask the respondent to indicate whether she is satisfied, dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied. By giving the respondent one response option to express satisfaction and 2 response options to express dissatisfaction, this survey question is biased towards getting a dissatisfied response. So you had 1 option for having satisfaction and then 2 for dissatisfaction. So that's why it's called a leading question. All right. The other example is social desirability. So people want to appear in a good light. They may be resistant to responding in a way they perceive to be less socially acceptable. So if somebody just wants to be nice and they don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, that could be social desirability. So an example, people will be reluctant to indicate behavior that is illegal or socially undesirable, such as drinking underage or smoking. Okay, so let's think about those. And let's look at the 3 examples at the bottom, and we're going to see what kind of response bias we think. Is it going to be leading question, or is it going to be social desirability? So if you want to pause the video and try it, you can do that in 1, 2, 3. All right, so for A, should concerned dog owners vaccinate their pets? So I would call this one a leading question because you're only asking for one type of response. You're looking at should they vaccinate. You're not talking anything about should they not vaccinate. B, how smart is blank when it comes to foreign policy? So how smart is Joe Biden? How smart is Donald Trump? I'd call that one a leading question also. And then C, have you ever shoplifted? And that one I would call social desirability. Because most people don't want to say if they've actually shoplifted. Some people don't care, but most people think it will be frowned upon if they answered yes. Alright, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at these examples, and I want you to see if you think that they are selection bias, non-response bias, or voluntary bias. So you try that in 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I abbreviated mine SB if it was selection bias, NB for non-response bias, or VB for voluntary bias. So for number 1, I got selection bias. Number 2, the non-response bias. Number 3, non-response bias. Number 4, non-response bias. Number 5, volunteer bias. And the last one, response bias. So if you want to argue about those, you can message me and we'll see if we can come up with the same thing. All right, thanks.